Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this, the first of the Archbishop's Breakfast Conversations for 2014. And as we gather here this morning, we acknowledge the original custodians of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and their elders, both past and present. My name is Chris Lancaster, and I'm the Assistant Curate in the parish of St Andrew in Brighton. And I'm your MC for this morning's conversation, which is on the topic Cutting Carbon, Australian Answers to a World Problem. And joining the Archbishop this morning for this conversation, we have two guests who we might say are part of answers to this problem from the highest level, working with government, and at grassroots level. Professor Ross Garnaut is a Professional Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne. He's the author of numerous books, monographs and articles in scholarly journals on international economics, public finance and economic development, particularly in relation to East Asia and the Southwest Pacific. Professor Garnaut has also had long-standing and successful roles as a policy advisor, diplomat and businessman. He was the senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Bob Hawke from 1983 to 1985 and subsequently served as the Australian ambassador to China. And in September 2008, he presented the Garnaut Climate Change Review, which was commissioned by the Australian government and examines the impact of climate change on the Australian economy and provides potential medium to long-term policies to ameliorate those effects. In 2009, Professor Garnaut was awarded the degree of Doctor of Letters honoris causa from the Australian National University and was made a Distinguished Fellow of the Economic Society of Australia. Also joining the Archbishop this morning is Natalie Isaacs, who in 2007 co-founded Australian Climate Coolers, a new non-profit women's organisation that exists to drive practical action on climate change. 1 Million Women, which was launched in May 2009, is Climate Cooler's first major campaign and follows the development of innovative grassroots community programs for kindergartens and schools. Natalie leads this 1 Million Women campaign, which aims to inspire and mobilise 1 million Australian women, each to cut a minimum 1 tonne of carbon dioxide pollution in their daily lives. And in less than 5 years, Natalie, with much support from a team of amazing staff and stakeholders, has built 1 Million Women from scratch to international recognition as the leading Australian women's organisation acting on climate change. And in September last year, Natalie was the sole Australian delegate at the invitation-only International Women's Earth and Climate Summit in New York, bringing together 100 women leaders on climate action from 35 different countries. So without further ado, I hand over to Archbishop Philip, to Professor Ross Garnaut and to Natalie Isaacs.
Thank you, Chris. I thought this was an important conversation to have because we've really moved in our national discourse from climate change being a word often used as a situation that policy needed to be addressed to one where we're told it's a problem and the policies we have in place need to be removed because they're creating difficulties. So, Ross, you've been right in the middle of our current policies. You've had a chance to think about it. What do you think you got wrong in the advice that's been turned into legislation?
Well, Archbishop, I think that what Australia's got in place is doing the job pretty well. After generations of carbon emissions just rising steadily year by year, things turn around in 2012 and the trend's been changed and the total emissions is going down. And they're going down quite a lot in those parts of the economy where the policies apply. For example, the electricity sector, emissions down 7% in the first year of the new policies. And it's doing that without causing great disruption in the economy. In fact, a fair bit of care was taken with the policies to avoid big disruption. When companies pay for a permit for emission, that affects their behaviour. But the money that they pay doesn't just disappear. It goes to the government, and that was given back as tax cuts, adjustments of social security, so that Australians on low and middle incomes weren't made poorer. They still had an incentive to use less goods and services that contain carbon, because the prices of those things rose relative to other things, but they got cash compensation. Other parts of the money were used for support for renewable energy, which has been growing quite rapidly from a low base. So I think things are working pretty well. The rest of the world does too. Christine Lagarde, the IMF Managing Director, formerly Finance Minister of France, said just before her recent visit to Australia has been a leader in this area, and the rest of the world hopes that Australia will stay a leader and not go backwards. Discount as you may things that I say, because I was associated with development of the policies, but after these years, and it's quite some years since I first made recommendations, I think things are working pretty well. Now, they didn't work politically, obviously, because the opposition, now the government, was able to make such a big issue of these things. But I think that was a symptom of a problem in our political culture.
Well, we'll open it up later, and we may, in fact, have some views that want to engage with those propositions. But in the current environment, Natalie, you and your organisation have seen some fantastic pilots of people reducing their carbon emissions and also reducing their household costs. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, and just going to Ross's point, there are areas in the community that you can see real results, and renewable energy and solar panels on people's roofs. Several years ago there was something like 5,000 maybe houses, and now there's over 1 million, and so people love solar in this country, and you can really see that happening, and we focus on the day-to-day things, the practical things that you do in your life to cut waste and pollution. So household electricity is a big one for us, and it's the low-hanging fruit. And last year we did this wonderful project with the City of Sydney, and who are also fantastic in this area. And it was 10 very different households, 10 very different women, and they had a challenge to get their electricity consumption down by 20%, and it was a 3-month project, and they absolutely smashed it. The average was 45%. One of our participants got their electricity bill down by $800 from $1,200 to $600, and it was the learnings of those 10 women and the way that they approached electricity reduction in their own households, and that's enormous power. If 1 million households could get their electricity consumption down by 20%, it's something like $240 million back in your pockets, and that's a real incentive.
One of the things I'm interested in the development of this discussion is really the use of I think it's very close to religious language in this matter, that you have people who are believers. They hold what seems to be a body of orthodox doctrine. There are people who are the atheists, who say they are the climate change skeptics. You get people who, perhaps Natalie, you might tell us about, who have a conversion experience, for whom this becomes a powerful moral issue. But I'm just interested in the whole concept, because I wonder if we are often driven to those kind of positions and language because of the the complexity of things. We're dealing with something which is complex, and for most people here, there are attitudes of belief that seem to come in, as well as an assertion of facts. And Ross, you've been an economist a long time. You know how people often criticise economics as not being as scientific as other more quantitative sciences. But do you think have you heard this kind of language sort of shift I'm talking about, where it's a matter of dogma more than a matter of persuasion and fact?
Well, there is a lot of religious language, and I must say I've introduced some of myself with a diabolical policy problem, and I think that's because this is a really important moral issue. It's an issue where what some people do affects the welfare of a lot of other people, and the consequences are large, and particularly large for vulnerable people. It's a very difficult ethical problem because the consequences of the action are some distance in time and perhaps in space from the action, and so that makes it easier to close one's mind to the connection between action and consequences. But closing one's mind does not remove the relationship. So I think we move into moral language because it's an important moral question.
It's interesting. I mean, just Maurice Newman, who's the chairman of the Prime Minister's Business Advisory Council, wrote an article in January where he was saying the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had, and this are his words, not been a panel of scientists, but a panel of governments driven by the UN, and saying that it was some sort of a cartel which had hundreds of billions of dollars at stake and would deny all contrary evidence. So you've got persuasive people saying some very powerful and strong things, in a sense, condemning the whole ensemble of apparatus that's been put together. That seems a bit unusual for otherwise considered people to quickly abandon these ideas.
Yes, it's not unusual to have denial of uncomfortable truths by a proportion of the population. That's actually normal. But what's unusual about Australia at this time is that those views are held by people in very important positions of influence. We're more used to seeing people denying the origins of HIV/AIDS, or people denying the effectiveness of immunisation around the fringes of the public discussion. But here we've got those sorts of views at the moment at the heart of government. I think it's particularly an issue in Australia. You don't get quite the same vigorous contestation of the science in other developed countries. You don't get them in those developing countries where you've got a strong scientific tradition, like China or India. It's closest to Australia's probably the worst in terms of the prominence of people who don't accept the veracity of basic science. The closest to us are the United States and Canada, and what these three countries have in common is they've got unusually large fossil fuel industries, and so in our country and in the United States and Canada, people who have a particularly strong vested interest in the science being wrong are more prominent in society. It's not unusual in human society for people's positions on issues where people stand to depend on where they sit, and I think that phenomenon is quite important in Australia.
Well, Natalie, tell us how you got this idea and changed your career in the cosmetics industry into something which was quite different. What was, where did you come from? What had changed your ideas, and how did you animate a passion about activism at a community level?
Well, it's interesting, just talking about belief and all of that, because this isn't about belief, and I've been saying for quite some time, do you believe in climate change or don't you? And I think we've got to get the word "do you believe in climate change or not" completely out of our language, because the science is in, it's overwhelming, and I just wish some people in high places would catch up on that. But for me, I had my head buried in the sand for forever. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not an activist. I used to be a cosmetics manufacturer, so my life was all about overpackaging. And I was disconnected. Too overwhelming, too complex, not my problem. It's somebody else's issue, and I can happily go along living my life disconnected to this. But in 2006, I had an epiphany. I changed, and it was actually during a time when I think the media got the point on climate change, and so you couldn't actually open a magazine or listen to the radio or watch any kind of mainstream media and not see something on climate change. And they really brought the information into a language that I could understand. And so I got the point. But I then decided to stop making excuses. But the thing is, what I did is I took action in my life. So I decided to get my electricity bill down by 20%. And it was really easy to do. And when I did it and then saw this result, that I saved money and saved pollution, I cannot tell you the sense of empowerment with that one little action. And that was the epiphany. And I realised, in fact, climate change and all what comes with it is actually all about me. It's all about my family. It's all about my friends. It's all about our future. So get on with it and do something about it. And that really then brought me to 1 million women, because I figured there must be millions of other women out there like me, not engaged on this issue for whatever reason, whether you're too busy or whether it's too complicated. It doesn't matter, whatever the reason. And if there was a way you could take them along the same journey as me, doing bite-sized actions with these real and tangible results, there you've got behaviour change, because that's this sense of empowerment that leads to power, that leads to finding your voice. There's a whole lot of dynamics that come with once you take ownership of the issue. You expect nothing less from anybody else. And so that's my real personal story with this, and how I came to then launch 1 Million Women.
Because what you're encouraging people to do might sound very much like where government policy is encouraging people in so-called direct action. And I could sort of see that individuals being responsible, the single individual taking their responsibility would be part of a broad social approach that might be ideologically favoured by thinkers in the government. But you don't discredit these other policy things as well, I understand. You're not trying to replace current policy with the initiatives you're putting forward.
Direct action, practical action, whatever you want to call it, is something that grassroots organisations and individuals and communities need to do. We all have to take responsibility, and that's what we need to do. That's our job. It's not the role of governments to put in policies like direct action. That's my opinion. It's what communities should do, and governments have to lead with far more than direct action.
Well, I'm sure we'll have some interaction around that and some engaging discussion. But Ross, tell us about. You can hardly be an advocate for the destruction of the policies that you've shaped and put in place. But as far as I can see, there is you'd think direct action sounds like building more wind farms, subsidising people to have more solar panels on their roof, doing these kind of things, all of which, most people here would probably think, well, they're not bad ideas, we'll probably get in and do that. Is that what's being put in as a substitute for the carbon pricing policies?
Well, direct action's a terrific name. It was a wonderful bit of political marketing. I think one of the reasons for its political success was it is such a good name, and then people could build in their own conception of its content. Yeah. And we didn't know what its content was at the last election. It wasn't until we got a green paper on the emissions reduction fund just in December that we actually knew anything about how it would work. Well, I made a submission to the Senate committee looking at direct action at the end of last week, and in preparation for that I had a really close look, and it's not much at all really. The proposal is that the government will have a limited amount of money and then invite companies to bid for reducing their emissions, and whoever bids that they will reduce emissions the most for the amount of money available will be given that money. But as proposed, there are no controls on what anyone else does, or even on what that same company does in projects other than that in which it's being paid to reduce emissions. So the overall effect of it is not at all certain. And we may very well have the expenditure of a fair bit of money going out to high-polluting businesses without much effect at all on overall
But the focus is on big corporate activity rather than households, as perhaps some people might have filled in the space and thought this would be a new era of households becoming more energy efficient or supported by government to reach those steps.
Yeah, it's not about households. It'll take quite a lot of effort and money to prepare a bid for the emissions reduction fund. Maybe farms or farm groups, but they are already getting larger incentives under the carbon pricing arrangements, because under the carbon farming initiative and current policies, farmers who sequester carbon in soils will get credits for that. They do now, and can sell that to an emitting business that has to hand over.
And how much money would be lost out of government revenues with the elimination of carbon pricing?
More just at the moment, because we've got a relatively high price, but the proposal is to link it to Europe and have the same prices as Europe within a couple of years. Once that all settles down, I estimate the minimum cost will be $4 to $5 billion a year, several billion for the loss of revenue from companies not having to buy the permits, and the rest for what the government pays out under the emissions reduction fund. Well, $4 to $5 billion a year minimum, probably much more if the government's serious about meeting Australia's emissions reduction targets. But even if it's only $4 to $5 billion, that's a lot of money. And that will require a lot of cuts in the rest of the budget to make way for that. So it's not only an environmental issue. One should be thinking about the consequences for the other things that government can no longer do because they're going this way.
Now, Ross, you're telling me that the part of the demographic that least gets this are sort of over 50s males. Now, you've got a few of them here today. we might discover what their attitudes are, but the sense of younger people and perhaps women getting the question and the challenge and the intergenerational character of this whole question of human-caused and industrially caused climate change seems to be one there. What would you say to people who might be in your target group of ones who least get this idea?
Well, not everyone in this demographic doesn't get the idea, but...
well, we'll find out anyway later.
Yeah, well, the doyen of post-war economists in America, Paul Samuelson, once said that economics progresses through funerals. It's, and he said that at the age of 88. the type of people we are as humans, once we have developed strong views on something, they don't change very easily. You have to work on understanding something new, and you have to work to change your view. And the easy thing is not to change your view, not to absorb new information, but a new generation coming along, just learning in their high school and university science the accepted truths like climate science, like gravity here, their views will be very different. And it is only relatively recently, the last couple of decades, that the science has been good enough to give very clear guidance on what changes are needed to stabilise the climate. So it's not surprising that people who did not grow up with the issue have to put a lot of effort in to understand. And I must say that until I was commissioned by all the state governments and the federal government 7 years ago, to work on this, and I spent a fair bit of time then reading deeply into the scientific evidence. And until I'd done that, I accepted that there was something important in this area, but I actually didn't know enough about it to hold those views with conviction.
And Natalie, when you're doing your work, community activism, do you find you get much pushback, much criticism, people writing to you telling you you're wasting your time, why you're bothering doing this? Or what's the kind of the range? I mean, obviously you've got people eager to support you, you've got the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat recognising your movement and your initiative, but do you get pushback and people who are expressing this sort of negativity?
Well, it depends what year it is, but a couple of years ago, we did our first, stall at the Royal Easter Show in Sydney, and it was amazing. We had 120 volunteers, and we signed up something like 3,500 women just over that period at the Easter show. And yet I had volunteers running out of the pavilion in tears because of the vicious and ferocious attacks that we were getting at that time, just in, I think it was April 2010. And so there was, that was a surprise, because when we launched, it was almost like the halcyon days with bipartisan support, and we launched without any negativity. But so that was a very particular moment, and I guess it comes and goes. But on the whole, our job is to focus on that group of people that are the leaners, the ones that you can get hold of and take them, and the laggards we just don't spend too much time with.
So from 2010 to now, have you seen the response is more like the 2010 Royal Easter Show, or have... No,
for us, it's been... We now have 92,000 incredibly engaged members, and so empowering people to change behaviour is not an easy thing, and that is what fundamentally 1 Million Women is all about. It's about changing some behaviours in a very structured framework, and so it's finding those touch points, and we find the emotional connect, the ways that you internalise climate change through these real stories, through real actions, through these tangible results, and so that's what we focus on. But interestingly, the CSIRO brought out a report earlier this year, and they surveyed 5,000 people, and it was their attitudes to climate change. And although 80% of them said that yes, I won't use the word belief, but that climate change is real and happening, yet on a list of 16 things of where do you sit as a priority, it was number 14, so it was 2 from the bottom. So that's challenging because there's this disconnect that somehow climate change is happening, but I don't really need to do much about it.
Yeah, I suppose in my own personal journey in this is that having been, my first degree was in a science degree, the physics of greenhouse gases certainly was undisputed by anyone that I was around studying with in the 1970s. So you're talking about the physics of the action of different gases in a complex system, and because the climate is a complex gaseous system, there are many factors and many time lags, but, and I think I've said this here before, when you stand near any coal port and you see, as you generally do, 30 or 40 coal ships lined up, and they're sort of, the great stockpiles of coal, and you think, well, when you release really solid carbon material and it turns into a gaseous form, the atmosphere is not infinite in its capacity, and we are putting enormous amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And if you only have to, you don't have to, it's not a matter of belief or principle, even though I think there are some, and I'll perhaps come to those at a time, some belief issues that might support Christians in wanting to be very concerned about these matters because of our beliefs about the important human responsibility in the stewardship of creation. But the facts of a physical system, are indisputable. So I find it rather curious that when the physics is quite simple and quite demonstrable, has been known for many decades, that the kind of there's some aspect of bringing it back to a personal values system, a denial, because as far as I can see, the policies that we now have in place, they haven't impacted that detrimentally on people's self-interest. People have been poor, have been subsidised for the cost of increased electricity and other things. So it's people here might be able to help us understand this in the discussion. But the normal kind of things that would probably make people rise up out of self-interest, they don't seem to be there either. Do you make any sense of that, Ross?
Well, there are some interests that are damaged by effective action against climate change. And for example, coal industry interests. If people are using electricity, if the way we make electricity is less based on coal, then people who own coal assets will see a reduction in the value of those assets. That happens whether or not Australia takes action, because Australian mining companies, coal mining companies, have taken big losses because China is reducing its reliance on coal. And so expectations that they would be bigger and bigger markets led to big investments in coal production, and they're losing money. So it's what the whole world does that affects those coal interests. But there are some interests that are damaged financially, and that's part of the adjustment that we as a society have to make. But there's one particular step that was very important for me in drawing the link between the personal decisions that Natalie's talking about and the high policy outcomes. And I mentioned this to you the other day, Philip, the book by Broome on the ethics of climate change. I had tended to think that that this is mainly an issue of big policies and what countries as a whole do, and that even what one small country does alone doesn't matter, that Australia needs to do its fair share to encourage the world as a whole to do it, and that if the world as a whole didn't take action, then we would have failed utterly. But Broome, who's Professor of Ethics at Oxford, in this little book makes the point that at the margin, the extra tonne of carbon from one individual will make things a bit worse and will cross some margin somewhere at some time. So we don't know the person who will be the marginal
Yes.
victim of worsening climate. It might be a baby born in Bangladesh in 20 years' time. But Broome makes the point that morally it does not matter that you don't know who the victim of your antisocial action is,
Yes.
any more than it ceases to be antisocial to fire a gun into a crowd if you don't know who your victim will be. So it was a rather simple point, but one that was quite important to me in drawing a bridge between the personal action and the overall outcomes.
And Natalie, that really resonates with you and your movement?
Oh, absolutely. But just going back to the point on people rising up, what's happening at the Great Barrier Reef at the moment, and when you look at that they are building outside Gladstone the biggest coal port in the world in order to ship more coal, dig it up and ship it out, and which will be dumping 3 million tonnes of dredge waste in World Heritage waters, and who knows what that's going to do to the Great Barrier Reef, which is already in poor health. And it's this overwhelming sadness that where does it stop? How do we change the infrastructure of what we do, where all this money, all this development, and the Great Barrier Reef is in peril, and it's because we are building bigger coal ports to dig up more coal to ship it out, when carbon pollution just keeps spewing out into the atmosphere. And I find that incredibly frightening.
And being absorbed in the oceans, which arguably is one of the threats to the Barrier Reef, the increased dissolved carbon dioxide in the water, the greater likelihood of algal growth and competition with corals in a higher temperature environment. So there's some, you put your finger on some very direct linkages.
That's from that, and then from this talking then on this personal level, and I was at the United Nations last conference in Warsaw. 1 million women received an award as one of 6 women's initiatives around the world acting on climate change. So it was a really wonderful honour for us, and we were there as guests of the UN, and I've never been to anything like this before, and regardless of what you think about these conferences, it was an incredible experience for me. And the thing that struck me was I was sitting in one of these plenary sessions and for at least 3 hours and listened to country after country after country, developing countries, developed countries, their prime ministers, their presidents, their ministers, get up and talk about pleading with everybody else in the room for real commitment, for strong action, for leadership on this, and that's where at this conference, where Australia was just missing at the negotiating table. They were. And going to Ross's point about leadership, and even though we're, we have to show that leadership on that level on the world stage, and that's just not happening at the moment.
And Ross, Paris, the European countries focusing on these questions, how are they looking towards Australia's leadership?
Every year we have a meeting of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and there's one scheduled for Paris in 2015, and the world as a whole is focusing on that Paris meeting as the time to make one more big effort to put in place a strong regime after 2020, which might be the last chance to take decisions that hold the human-induced increase in temperature to less than 2 degrees. Now, 2 degrees is still a lot. We've got a lot of disruption now when the increase has been a bit less than 1 degree.
Yes.
But there's a reasonable assessment that once you go beyond that, the compounding difficulties become much more unmanageable. So that's the focus of 2015. And I was in the UK and Germany over Christmas and New Year and was able to catch up with people working on these things. And there is a very strong focus in Europe on making that Paris meeting a very important step in really coming to grips with the problem internationally. And the United States and China have recently held a meeting, Secretary for State John Kerry with Chinese leaders, and they've agreed to work together towards a strong outcome in that meeting. Now, the feedback I was getting in Germany and the UK was that there is great disappointment at Australia because Australia didn't even send a representative, a ministerial representative to the last UN meeting, which was trying to develop momentum towards the Paris meeting. There's disappointment that Australia doesn't seem to be interested in pulling its weight. And we can be quite sure that that's being said privately to the Australian government. I read in the New York Times just a couple of days ago that the Secretary for State has given an instruction to the State Department that all US representatives abroad have to make it clear to their host governments that climate change is the biggest issue. And recently in Jakarta, the Secretary of State for the United States compared climate change to weapons of mass destruction and said this is the most formidable of weapons of mass destruction, and the international community has to come to grips with it. So we're an outlier at the moment. We're not moving in the same place as the countries with which we've tended to associate ourselves with Britain and Germany, with the United States, France, even with China. And I think that's going to be an awkward place for Australia to be in international relations, separately even from the climate issue itself.
One of the things we've seen recently has been the massive pollution in Beijing. Certainly as citizens' rights become more important, people are clearly going to find those situations of pollution intolerable there. We're probably inclined to think that a place like China is producing massive carbon emissions, and it's inevitable that'll be the case. But what's your take on China's longer policy directions with carbon reduction?
Well, there's been a big change in China. From 2000 to 2011, China, the world's most populous country, had stronger economic growth than any country has ever had, even faster economic growth than Japan had in the 60s. So it's a world record. It was also the most energy-intensive and metals-intensive growth we've ever seen in the world. So it wasn't only a big country, unusually rapid growth, but it was very energy and metals intensive. Now, it was brilliantly successful in some things, including in raising living standards, material consumption of ordinary people. But towards the end of this period, towards 2011, it became clear that the consequences weren't all good. There was some very serious downside, and the biggest of the downside was environmental. Now, China has a very sophisticated scientific community, and leading scientists were pointing out to the government, the Academy of Science pointing out to the government, the contribution that this huge growth, especially of coal use in China, was making to the global climate problem. And the Chinese leadership accepted that and started to put policies in place. And then in addition, you had this dreadful local problem. And the solution to the local environmental problem is the same as the solution to the global problem. Be careful about growth in use of coal and putting a whole lot more coal-based material into the atmosphere. So since 2011, we've had a very significant change in trajectory in Chinese emissions. Just for electricity generation, for for the first 11 years of this century, China's use of of coal in electricity generation grew by more than 10% per annum. Since 2011, it hasn't grown at all. Now, of course, the absolute level is high, and it's not only has to not grow, it has to start coming down. But not growing after a decade of double-digit growth is a big change. So they've made that first step, and the policies they're putting in place right now, driven partly by recognition of their contribution to a global problem, but partly by the very strong local concerns about health from the carbon particulates in the atmosphere, is driving policies that will see coal use for electricity starting to fall.
So I hope after all that's been shared that you have some questions for our panel this morning. We'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time before passing them on to the panel.
Natalie, this is a question for you, because in some ways, as Ross, as you're saying, we're all a bit disillusioned with what's happening at a macro government level. You said you reduced 20% in your own sort of personal house. I'm really interested to hear what were some of those simple things that you did and that we could all do to actually start the action ourselves.
If I told you that there's a new product about to be manufactured here in Victoria and shortly in the US, which, apart from anything else, will digest so-called greenhouse gases and break them up, with the byproduct being a particularly fine fertiliser, and by the way, I'm talking about something totally organic, no nasties, and its prime aim, if you like, is to break down things like oil spills, PCB plastic pollution, radionuclides and heavy metals contamination. Would you see that that would be a good thing or a bad thing?
Firstly, thank you all. And as a resident of Gippsland, just downwind of the Latrobe Valley, I'm wondering whether I could ask a couple of questions about the consequence of the recent Morwell mine fire, where the politicians were completely missing in action. In the first week, local media, it was the only story. In the second week, it was still the only story, and it had spread to the Melbourne media. And it took 3 weeks before a politician was actually sighted in the area on a TV camera. My understanding is they were actually there, but they weren't admitting it, which was sort of bizarre. So the whole thing was kind of run by the media and the local people. I'm wondering whether you could comment on the role of media and politicians in this kind of thing, and whether you think the wash-up of this might lead to a different way of viewing brown coal.
Thank you very much. So 3 questions for our panel. One on how do you reduce your electricity bill by 20%. Comments on a wonderful new product to digest greenhouse gases, and also on the management of the Morwell mine fire. So over to you. Perhaps, Natalie, for that first one was directed at you.
Well, it's interesting. When I got the point on climate change and reduced our household electricity by 20%, and I have to say that one was really simple. All I did was stop using our dryer, turned off everything at the wall, turned lights off, ran our pool pump an hour less a day. They're all those simple things that you think, oh, really, do they make a difference? And they actually make a huge difference. Anyone out there has a second fridge, just don't turn it on. It can save 1/2 ton of pollution a year. And if enough of us do those things, it makes an extraordinary difference. But just in other things in my life, we had terrible food waste. And food waste is actually still the largest component of the waste bin, and we can avoid up to 60% of the food we waste, and it's actually quite a big issue here in Australia. And we just got our food waste down by 50%, now it's almost like 80% by just getting a couple of worm farms, and thinking about the journey of food from when you go to the shopping centre or to the shops to what you do and how you manage its food, how you manage its waste. And it's just about rethinking the things that you do. Overconsumption is a huge issue in this country. We spend something like $10.5 billion every year on stuff that we barely or never use and just gets thrown into landfills. So thinking before you buy something, really asking yourself, do I really need that? Or just cutting out overconsumption altogether. There's a long list of things that we can all do in our lives, and I think that one of the main things is, it's all. I think there's an issue with society as a whole. This is probably going way beyond just your simple question, but I'd love to get this out there. I think there's some issue or fundamental flaw as a society when we go along ticking a box or sending a letter to a politician or deferring to others to do the hard work and think that we're environmentalists when at the same time we live unsustainable lives that's filled with overconsumption. And it is all that stuff that we can do in our lives to have the least impact on the planet that is incredibly powerful. So, answered your question tenfold.
Thank you. And so our other two questions about a product to digest gases and the Morwell fire for any of our panel.
Well, that new technology sounds terrific, and I'd like to know more about it. I think there are prospects for new technologies to capture carbon and either convert it into chemicals that can be stored safely, or converted into materials that have value. Really, that's what nature did over hundreds of millions, if not billions of years, to turn an atmosphere that was full of carbon dioxide and which would be uninhabitable by humans or mammals into today's atmosphere. Living organisms, algae and other things, took carbon from the atmosphere and turned it into limestone, which is a building material. And so it's been done before, but we need processes that can do it over months and years and not hundreds of millions of years. I think that part of our effort on climate change has to be support for technological innovation, because there are many possibilities for improving the relationship between economic activity and greenhouse gas emissions. That may very well be one, and look forward to learning more about it.
I think that you would need, if you follow my analogy of the 30 or 40 coal ships sitting off every coal port of Australia and the enormous gas tankers that are leaving from the Timor Sea gas reserves, you would need an industrial process that could turn atmospheric carbon back into such volumes of solid material at a greater rate than is currently being shipped out of the ground. So to actually get things back to, because we're really talking about the 1%, 2%, or catastrophic and irreversible 4%. I mean, the planet would undoubtedly survive if you returned the atmosphere to the Carboniferous age, when you had enormous forests growing in higher temperatures. Presumably, it mightn't be very hospitable towards mammals or humans, but there'd be a lot of growth that would one day, over millions of years, stabilise things. But I think that our interest is not to be part of such a big fluctuation of a geological cycle, but to be concerned about the speed at which we're enhancing those developments with not much limits in place. So I think, technology is to be welcomed, but we have not seen that its influence is anything like the speed at which we're releasing carbon emissions into the atmosphere.
Yep.
That's right.
Yeah, and on the point about the fires in Morwell and in Gippsland, that's given some Victorians a taste of what people in Chinese cities are living with. In Chinese cities, it's helped the determination to do something about the issue. It would be nice to think that could be the case here as well.
David Harper, it has been said by at least one, and I think many more, very highly qualified climate scientists, that 4 degrees of warming would mean the end of civilization. Could I ask Professor Garnaut whether that is an over-dramatisation?
It seems to me that the problem of emissions is the product of the amount of emissions per person times the number of people. And nowhere in this conversation about climate change have I heard anyone talking about the effect of population growth. But if you aim for a 20% reduction in emissions and you allow population to run rampant, then perhaps it's not a mathematical fact. In the same time that you might reduce emissions by 20%, you allow the population to double, then you actually need a reduction of 60% per person to achieve the same total output result. Would the panel like to comment?
Glenys Fraser, I'm intrigued by the disconnect that Natalie picked up on in her earlier comments about the mismatch between expressing concern about climate change to our leaders and the like, and then going back to our wasteful, overconsumptive lives, and particularly the psychology of changing these attitudes that we all have. And in a democracy in particular, we get the governments, we get the leaders we vote for, and this last federal government was elected on a platform where we knew what they were going to do with the carbon tax. We knew that they weren't known for their environmental policies, and we've all gone back to our lives where, research shows that young mums, who you would think would be the ones most concerned about climate change, when it comes to their comfort or time efficiency or the comfort of baby, will put dryers on. They're juggling jobs and they're filling up garbage tins of disposable nappies. So I guess we've all got to get real on an individual level, and to pick up on the previous gentleman's point, be concerned about how many people we bring into this world and what kind of world it is. So I guess my question is, psychologically, to me, that just seems like such a huge issue until we're almost on a war footing, emergency type situation when people will finally get the point. And I am a little despondent that the Natalies of the world and their epiphany moments are in the minority.
Thank you very much. So those 3 questions: is the projection of a 4-degree increase over dramatic? The question of population and the role of population growth, or indeed reduction, in climate change projections, and that struggle for the hearts and minds, the psychological aspect of the climate change campaign. So over to our panel again.
Yes, on the 4 degrees, 4 degrees of warming, and actually it could get a lot worse than that. 4 degrees is what you get if we change things a bit, if we reduce our emissions growth a bit. You get much worse than that if you don't change anything at all. But with 4 degrees, it would be a dramatic change in the physical environment. For example, with 4 degrees, the science says it would be inevitable that the Greenland ice cap will melt. It will take some time. The higher the temperature, the quicker it will melt, and that will raise sea levels 7 metres. It's very likely that the West Antarctic ice sheet would would melt at 4 degrees. Again, takes time, but that adds another 6 metres. Well, even add a couple of metres to sea level and you displace in storm surges a huge number of people, maybe in excess of 100 million in the deltas of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra in Bangladesh and West Bengal. Displace that number of people and you destabilise those countries and neighbouring countries. And with human society, if you give it a big enough shock, things fall apart. And the ultimate consequence for civilization is much greater than the initial shock. And the tolerance for those shocks of human society, organised human society, is not so great. We've got plenty of examples of history. Germany, at the time, arguably in the 20s and 30s, the best educated community, and in some sense, one of the highest points of civilization of humanity, had the shock of rising very high unemployment for a period, and the normal moral foundations of society fell apart, and you had Nazism. We should reflect upon that. Give society a big enough shock and things fall apart. And that's the sense in which I see civilization threatened by a large increase in temperature of 4 degrees. We will be giving human society such a big shock, displacing so many people, shaking the foundations of organised society to an extent that I think it's unlikely that normal patterns of political and social organisation would survive. And so then you do get disintegration of civilization as we know it. On population, a very important point, but what one has to think, what can you do about it? There are only a couple of countries in the world in which active population policy has had a major effect on fertility and population growth. The one-child policy in China, anti-natal policies in Singapore. These were authoritarian societies, very intrusive in family decisions, and not acceptable to most societies on Earth. And so I don't think we can assume that they're easily replicable elsewhere. The one clear, powerful long-term influence that we know about in reducing fertility, reducing population growth, is economic development and rising living standards, better education, especially of women, personal security of women, giving them greater control over their own lives. That, in the end, has a big effect on fertility. So in all of the reasonably high-income countries, we now have fertility at below replacement levels. But in much of the world where you still have endemic poverty, a failure of economic development, sadly, much of Africa, parts of the Middle East, you still have very high rates of fertility and population growth. So we can't really distinguish the problem of getting control of world population from the problem of global development.
And our third question was about the psychological battle.
It's a really hard question to answer. I know, and it is perplexing because, you know, before I got the point on climate change, I could sit around a dinner table and talk about climate change quite articulately and really understand, you know, the consequences if we don't act, but leave the dinner table and carry on, you know, just business as usual. And so what is that where there's that real deep disconnect from understanding an issue and then translating that into any real or significant action. That is a challenge. And behaviour change is a really hard thing because we're trying to do it inside this really structured framework. And so you go along thinking, okay, right, I'm going to do something, I'm going to change my life, and you try to change your behaviour in this framework. And so when you push up against the walls, it becomes all too hard, so you just go back to the way you were doing things. And so there has to be this real fundamental shift in the way that we think, the way that we do things. And the way I got the point on climate change and the way that we engage women and communities through 1 Million Women is through this level of internalising it. Because once you internalise it, like once you actually not just think it, but actually feel it, actually feel the effects, internalise climate change, at that point, in fact, changing behaviour becomes a lot easier than you think. Because what happens when you don't internalise it? Behaviour change just becomes gratuitous because you don't really believe in it, you're just doing it. But when you internalise it, it actually becomes part of the way that you live as opposed to an adjunct to it. You know, because we go along going, look, I live life like this. Oh, but I'm an environmentalist, or I look after the planet because I do these things too. And so it's always outside of how you live, as opposed to just doing it as part of who you are. I don't know if I'm answering the question clearly, but the way in 1 Million Women that we have found that we have taken women along this road of empowerment from being disconnected, from being in the camp of not doing anything, into the camp of real action, is through this real storytelling, showing that a behaviour change gives a result, and showing you that real action doesn't actually even matter if you don't know all the science. Doesn't matter if you're not aware of all the policies. It's just about action. So when you do something and you see a result in your life, it saved money, it cut pollution, it actually is greater than anything else you can imagine, because that's what then takes it on to the rest of the way that you live.
Thank you very much, Natalie and Ross. Let me thank you and all who have been part of the conversation this morning. Let me hand over to you, Archbishop Philip, to wrap up for this morning.
Yes, thank you, Chris, and thanks very much for that interaction. It would have been nice to have some more opportunity, because actually there's a lot of energy about questions and ideas. Because one of the things I guess, we're looking at personal responsibility. There's a whole sphere that we didn't deal with today, which is that whole question of people's shareholding choices. What are the ethical decisions people might make in being shareholders in companies that are primarily focused with the extraction of carbon fuels and the various processes. Should we as shareholders, should our superannuation funds better reward more environmentally sustainable corporations and others? But, there's a whole lot of ethical decisions, I think, that we've got in the mix, and we might have an opportunity of another time of returning to that kind of discussion, because it would have its own merits. But I think it's from my point of view, when at a time we've gone in our national discourse from it being probably reasonably undisputed that climate change was the biggest moral challenge that faced us, to clearly, if depending how the numbers in the Senate fall, that most of the measures that have been in place for a short time will be overturned, and some other measures that I think will be costly to our whole society, probably requiring about $4 billion to come out of taxpayers' funds, or reduction in other services. that we're not having sufficient of a national debate about these matters. There's a sense of inevitability, I think, that's happening. So I'm very grateful that we can here, at least this morning in this context, raise these important questions. I'm very grateful for my two guests for the energy and insight they've brought into it. So would you appreciate, please, Natalie and Ross for the insights they've given us. And would you join me as this conclude in prayer to ask God to give us wisdom in these matters? Loving God, we thank you that we understand the creation that we have been given a part of, the creation that we can play a role of stewardship in. We pray that you would enlarge our understanding, that we can grasp these complex matters of the role that we might have as individuals and as societies, of economic systems in the long-term health and prospering of human society, of environmental health for our planet. And we ask, Lord, that we would have, at the personal level and also at the social level, the wisdom to make those ethical decisions that consider others, consider those not yet born, people in distant or remote places from our immediate interests, and help us weigh those things along with our own personal concerns, that we can be responsible and appropriate in our living, in the decisions we make, and in the stewardship of the creation that we bear. And we pray for that wisdom in Jesus' name. Amen. So thank you very much. It's lovely. We've got some sun at our back and you've got some sun in your eyes. I hope that hasn't been too difficult for you, and look forward to seeing you again when we next talk about the changes in our industry policies and in our industrial production. Thank you.